This is from the book of Esther, chapter 4, verses 9 through 16. It says, Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, Go and gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish.
Ooh, good morning. Man, what a beautiful weekend, right? I mean, how many of y'all been outside enjoying the weather? It's been great. And it's even better to see all of us here today together to worship the Lord, to hear His word. And I know that God is pleased with that. Now, over the last 4 Sundays, we've been in this series called Heroes versus Zeros. And we have watched 4 heroic servants of God stare down overwhelming opposition. The first week we saw Moses face down Pharaoh, the reluctant shepherd who trusted God and shattered the chains of an empire. And then the next week we saw Daniel stand up to King Nebuchadnezzar, the exile whose quiet faith outshone a golden idol and toppled a king's pride. Then we saw Samson fight the Philistines, the flawed strong man God still used to shake the enemy's temple. And last week we saw Elijah face down Jezebel, the lone prophet whose single voice of truth silenced 450 prophets of Baal. Now each week we have learned that one obedient life partnered with an almighty God is always enough. And today we meet our final hero in this series. Her name is Esther, and she was a young exile whose courage saved a nation. I'm reminded of another young woman who had some difficult choices to make. During the Nazi occupation of Warsaw, a 29-year-old social worker named Irina Sendler gained access to the Jewish ghetto by claiming she needed to check on the sanitation. Well, what she was really doing was risking her life to smuggle out Jewish children from that ghetto. And she was able to get 2,500 of these children out, hiding infants in toolboxes and older children in burlap sacks. She wrote every child's real name in scraps of paper, buried them in glass jars, and vowed, when the war ends, I will dig them up and reunite them with their families. Irina was arrested by the Gestapo in 1943. She was tortured and she was sentenced to death. But somehow the Polish underground was able to bribe some officials and get her out of that prison, and she went into hiding for the remainder of the war. And after the war, she continued her career as a social worker, and she remained deeply involved in caring for children, although the communist regime in Poland limited her recognition, and they often persecuted her for her ties to the Polish resistance. Now, after the war, she had hoped to reunite those children with their families. But sadly, most of the parents had died in the Holocaust. And many of the children were adopted into Polish Catholic families or raised in orphanages. She did her best after the war to help reunite those children back into Jewish families. But given the devastation of the European Jewish community, only a very small percentage of them were able to be reconnected with surviving relatives. And for decades, her story was largely unknown outside of Poland. In 1965, Yad Vashem honored her as one of the righteous among the nations. But it wasn't until the late 1990s when a group of Kansas high school students, and if you're a high school student here today, don't think that you couldn't have an impact, but these students were researching the Holocaust, and they were doing this project they called Life in a Jar. And they rediscovered her story, which brought international recognition to her. And in 2003, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She lived to see her story widely told and was celebrated worldwide as a symbol of courage and compassion. Irena Sendler lived a long life. She passed away in 2008 at the age of 98. And though she did not get to see all those children she rescued grow up, many of them considered her a second mother, and they honored her memory throughout their lives. I just have a little question here. What if she had not responded to that godly prompting, that urge to risk her life to save those children, to do something that would make a difference? Well, we know that there's a high likelihood that 2,500 children would have lost their lives. We know that the families who were reunited after the war would probably never have been reunited. And there is a high likelihood that history would have never remembered Irena Sendler. Like Esther, Irena never planned to be a rescuer. She simply found herself in a situation no one else could help with, and she chose to act. Now, I bring this up because many of us assume that heroes are pre-selected super saints. However, God more often uses ordinary believers in ordinary places to accomplish His extraordinary purpose. And believe it or not, God will use you to make an impact in your community, in this church, and in individual lives. How will you be remembered? Now, the problem is that we often think God certainly can't use me. Like, we may think that we are ill-equipped to accomplish what we see needs to be done. We may feel unworthy of such a high calling because of our past failures, when in fact, maybe our past failures God can use to do the exact work that needs to be done. We can feel trapped by circumstances, maybe our jobs or schools or neighborhoods, and maybe we're wondering, does where I am even matter? Esther's story proves that sovereign placement plus courageous obedience equals life-changing deliverance. And so our big idea is this today: God positions His people for a purpose beyond themselves. Think about that. God positions His people for a purpose beyond themselves. And if that's true, the first question is obvious. Why has God positioned you where you are? Our first point is this: God places you where you are for a reason. I want us to think about the situation that Esther and her people were facing. Esther lived during the Persian Empire under King Xerxes around the mid-5th century BC. The Jews were in exile, they were scattered, they were vulnerable, without the security of their homeland. Early in Xerxes' reign, he held this lavish 180-day feast to show off his wealth and his power. And at the penultimate part of the event, he ordered his wife, Queen Vashti, to appear before his drunken officials so he could display her beauty. What woman couldn't refuse such an offer, right? Well, she refused it. And in the Persian culture, the queen's defiance was not only a personal insult, but it was a public humiliation of the king. His advisors were very concerned and worried. They feared that her disobedience would set a dangerous precedent for the wives across the empire. Their thinking was, what if all the wives in the kingdom began to refuse their husbands? What a horrendous thought, right? To preserve his pride and control. And I know this isn't an issue with most of you out here, right? Most of you men, your wives do exactly what you want them to do all the time. Xerxes deposed Vashti. A law was issued declaring that every man should be master of his own household. Where's that law today? And after Xerxes' anger subsided, his attendants suggested a search for a new queen. So beautiful young women from across the empire were brought into the king's harem, given beauty treatments, and from them the king would choose his new queen. We pick up our story in Esther chapter 2 and verse 8. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. So Esther, again a young Jewish girl, became queen not by her choice. She's not out there volunteering. This isn't like a beauty, let's go to the beauty contest. That's not what this was. But she was put in a place by circumstance. She was taken. She was not volunteering. And she concealed her Jewish identity, living in a pagan palace, married to a king known for his volatility and pride. Imagine a young girl thrust into that situation. She has no real power. From a strictly human standpoint, she is totally at the mercy of this king. To add to this situation, there's an unknown to her, an enemy, a man named Haman, who was a powerful official, and he was able to manipulate Xerxes into issuing an irrevocable decree to annihilate all the Jews in the empire. It wasn't just Esther's life and her family at risk. This was an extinction-level threat. When Esther's uncle Mordecai received notice of this law, he sent word to Esther and asked her to approach the king and plea for his mercy. Now, at first, Esther sort of kept quiet. To reveal her Jewish identity risked her position and her life. And when she received word of this from Mordecai's request, she sent him this reply, and we read it in Esther 4:11. All the king's officials and the people of the royal palaces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to the king. Now, I want you to understand that this is not like a normal home life. Now, we see our husbands and wives see each other all the time. We live together. We hopefully talk to each other and we have some connection. But in that situation, the dynamics of King Xerxes and Queen Esther, she could only see him when he told her to come see him. So they weren't really living together. But her uncle Mordecai challenged her, and in verses 13 through 14 we read, "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Now, what Mordecai did is he reframed her identity. She was not just a queen by chance. She was queen by God's appointment. In other words, God put her there at that time and in that place for a reason. The Apostle Paul echoes that same truth in Acts 17 when he's preaching at the Areopagus in the city of Athens, and he says to these people, "From one man, God made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands." I think each of us needs to ask the question, God, why did you put me in this place at this time? What is it that you want me to do where I am? There's a lady I read about. Maybe you've seen a movie about her, Katherine Johnson. What a great example of someone being in the right place at the right time. She was an African-American mathematician immortalized in the movie Hidden Figures. Anybody see that movie, Hidden Figures? Really wonderful movie. Well, back then, NASA was pretty segregated, and they put Catherine back in a back office so nobody could see her. And she was computing the trajectory of John Glenn's orbit for the Apollo 11 landing. Now, these calculations were normally done by some new IBM computers, but the astronauts did not trust the computers. They trusted Katherine Johnson's computing. And she was very humble. She said, "I was just doing my job." Now, her humble brilliance is precisely where God placed her. And because of that, she was able to help these men come back. And not only did that happen, but she sort of cracked the ceiling for women and women of color in science, technology, engineering, and math fields. She was an unlikely hero because of the social and cultural hurdles she had to jump through. But she was the one who was able to come up with a plan to save those astronauts. I want you to think about these truths. If God controls the map and the calendar, your address is not accidental. And that means that each day we should be focusing on God's assignment. Maybe we shouldn't just ask, "Why am I here?" Maybe we need to also ask, who needs God through me here? Who is it that I need to reach out to in this place? Someone's rescue may depend upon our presence. Remember, God has placed you where you are for a reason. God may have placed you in the office cubicle, so a coworker battling depression has someone who will listen to them and pray for them. God may have placed you in the bleachers so another parent can see Christ through the way you encourage and support. God may have placed you in the waiting room so you can share hope with someone facing a frightening diagnosis. God may have placed you as a step-parent so a hurting child will know what unconditional love looks like. God may have allowed you to struggle through some financial situation so that you can later testify that His provision is real when everything else runs out. Friends, don't just consider the obstacles. Consider what purpose might be behind the obstacle. But knowing our purpose is only half the battle. Living it demands courage. And that brings us to our second thought today, that boldness is risky, but obedience is worth it. Esther answered Mordecai in Esther 4:16. She said, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not drink or eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." I want you to think about Esther's response to her uncle's request. Before acting, she asked Mordecai to gather all the Jews in Susa to fast and pray for 3 days. Now, this shows to me her humility and her dependence upon God, not in her own wisdom or manipulation or strategy. She knew that her success depended on God's blessing. And after the fast, she said, "I will go to the king, even though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So she counted the cost, but she chose obedience anyway. She determined that live or die, she would do what needed to be done. It's sort of similar to what God told Joshua in Joshua 1:9. "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Friends, we can be courageous because we believe in the power of God. Amen? That's why we can be courageous. I'm probably going to ruin this lady's name. But when Malala Yousafzai blogged at age 11 about the Taliban banning girls' education, she knew what the risk was. And 4 years later, at the age of 15, she was shot in the head on her school bus. But she lived. And later, she forgave those who attacked her. She became the youngest Nobel laureate, advocating for every child's right to learn. You see, friends, courage is faith that's taken a step. Every God assignment carries risk. But friends, disobedience is riskier. If I'm not living in the will of God, it is riskier than if I am living in the will of God. And friends, our fear will shrink when our conviction looms larger. You see, God's presence doesn't cancel danger, but it does outweigh it. So here are some risky things that God may be calling you to do that require boldness and obedience. Maybe sharing your faith with a coworker or a friend who may mock or reject you. It certainly is a risk. Standing firm in biblical truth on cultural issues when it may cost reputation or relationship or somebody trying to cancel you. Publicly identifying as a follower of Jesus, even in a hostile environment, like Esther revealing her identity. Confronting a loved one about destructive behavior in love, knowing it may strain the relationship. Choosing to forgive someone who deeply wronged you, even when others expect bitterness. reconciling with someone you've been estranged from, risking rejection or hurt again. Giving financially in a way that feels scary. That means that we're putting our trust in God. Opening our home to foster or adopt a child, knowing the challenges involved. Sacrificing career advancement and achievement or comfort to prioritize God's call for you to missions or ministry or to service. Going on a mission trip to a place that's maybe dangerous or way far outside your comfort zone. Standing up for the vulnerable or the oppressed, even if it puts you at odds with some powerful people. Starting a new ministry or outreach in your community, uncertain of whether it will succeed. Saying no when pressured to compromise your integrity at school or at work. Choosing purity and holiness when temptation promises pleasure. Speaking truth in love when silence would be safer. Friends, when we do step out, we often discover a third breathtaking reality. That God turns evil plans into good purposes. Even when someone means to do us evil or harm, God can take that and turn it on its head and use it for something good. Now, we mentioned a man named Haman earlier who had plotted to have all the Jews exterminated. Well, now we find that his plot backfired spectacularly while Mordecai and Esther's plan was blessed. After 3 days of fasting, Esther courageously entered the king's presence uninvited, which was an act punishable by death unless the king extended his golden scepter. And there was a tense moment for her until Xerxes received her favorably. Instead of blurting out her request, Esther invited Xerxes and Haman to a private banquet that she had prepared. At the banquet, when Xerxes again asked her what she wanted, Esther invited them to come to a second banquet the next day, promising them to reveal her request. So why the delay? Now, many believe Esther was carefully setting the stage, waiting for God's perfect timing, and heightening the king's curiosity and anticipation. Haman left the first banquet gloating over his special status, that he had been invited alone with the king and the queen. Remember, he has no idea that Esther is Jewish. But his pride was wounded as he's leaving when Mordecai refused to bow to him at the city gate. And at the urging of his wife and his friends, Haman ordered gallows be built, planning to ask Xerxes the next morning for Mordecai's execution. Well, something funny happens when God is involved. That night, Xerxes couldn't sleep. So if you ever wake up in the middle of the night and you can't sleep, you might want to be thinking, is God trying to tell me something here? He had the royal chronicles read to him and discovered that Mordecai had once exposed an assassination plot, but he had never been rewarded for doing that good work. So this divine coincidence positioned Mordecai for honor right before Haman could move against him. In irony, Xerxes commanded Haman to parade Mordecai through the city, honoring him publicly. I love that part, don't you? So then comes the second banquet. Xerxes again asked Esther for her petition. What is it? that he could do for her. Now, Esther boldly revealed her identity as a Jew and exposed Haman's plot. In verse 4 of chapter 7, she says, "We have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated." And Xerxes was enraged. And when he stepped away to collect himself, if you can just close your eyes, if you're not, don't do it if you're going to fall asleep, but just close your eyes and imagine this. Xerxes steps out of the room. Haman runs over to Esther's couch, begging for mercy. And the king comes in as Haman is there at the couch with her, and he thinks he's assaulting the queen. So Xerxes ordered Haman to be executed on the very gallows he had built to kill Mordecai on. In verses 9 through 10 of Esther 7, we read, "Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, 'A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. And the king said, impale him on it.' And so they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. And then the king's fury subsided." You know, God put Esther in just the right place at just the right time to effectively save her people. And she was able to take the plans of evil men and turn them around to bless his people. The banquets weren't just social events. They were God-orchestrated turning points where everything shifted from danger to deliverance, at least from Esther's point of view. Maybe not Haman's. Esther's story asks, will you leverage where you are? Will you risk what you have? Will you trust God with the outcome? Heroes rise when ordinary believers answer yes to those questions. Now, Paul captured that principle in Romans 8:28 when he wrote, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." I'm reminded of a terrible event that happened back in 1956. How many of y'all were alive in 1956? Anybody raise your hand? Yeah, I see some old friends out there. Y'all beat me here. 1956. 5 young missionaries, including one named Jim Elliot, were speared to death by a tribe of warriors in Ecuador. Now, their grief, the grief of their families, could have ended that work. But Jim Elliot's widow, Elizabeth, and one of the other victims, Nate Saint, his sister, Rachel, later moved into the tribe, and they led many of the very men who killed their loved ones to Christ, including the warrior Menkai. Menkai is the very one who had speared Jim Elliot. And he would become a Christian because of Jim Elliot's widow. What Satan meant for slaughter became that entire tribe's salvation. Jim Elliot once was quoted, "Missionaries are very human folks doing what they are asked. Simply a bunch of nobodies trying to exalt somebody, and somebody spelled with a capital S. And we know who somebody is." Shouldn't that be the cry from each of us? To simply be a bunch of nobodies trying to exalt somebody, Jesus Christ. Satan wants to create evil scenarios to stop us from doing that. Think about it. He tried to stop God's plan by stopping God's people in Egypt, as Pharaoh tried to prevent God's people from leaving. He tried to stop God's plan when King Nebuchadnezzar took the captives to Babylon. He tried to stop God's plan by tempting Samson with Delilah. He tried to stop God's plan by scaring Elijah with Jezebel's threats. He tried to stop God's plan by tricking Xerxes into slaughtering God's people. But each time, God used someone to step up. And there are plenty of other examples. What looked like the ultimate injustice, the crucifixion of an innocent man named Jesus, became the very means of salvation for the world. Soviet attempts to stamp out Christianity under Joseph Stalin scattered believers, and underground churches multiplied instead. While churches were shut down during China's Cultural Revolution, their underground churches and house churches grew into one of the largest Christian movements in the world. Joni Eareckson Tada, you may be familiar with her. A diving accident left her paralyzed, but God used her story to inspire millions worldwide through her ministry to the disabled. Now, what about you? The gallows built for you may become God's billboard for grace. Evil never writes the final sentence, friends, because God always edits every ending. And so your pain today may prove to pave the way for someone else's salvation tomorrow. And I just want to encourage you to trust God with the plot twists. Isn't that what life is filled with? A lot of plot twists. We wake up today and we have no idea what the end of the day is going to look like. But God is the author of redemption. So when you're going through a trial, don't let bitterness or doubt rule the day. Turn it over to God. Ask God what He means for you to learn from it. Hold on to the hope that the struggle you face today will mean hope for someone else tomorrow. And remember, God positions His people for a purpose beyond themselves. God may not have brought the pain or the suffering, but God can turn it around and He can use it not only for your good, but also for the good of others. Now, before we have our communion this morning, I want to leave you with a couple of questions to ponder. Where has God placed you for such a time as this? And who is waiting on your obedience? And the second question is this: what step of courage, though risky, might God use to turn darkness into light for someone else? Think about those things, and we'll come back together in just a moment for communion.